History is not shaped only by empires, kings, or the clash of steel. It's shaped by moments when ordinary people refuse to kneel. When courage stands taller than logic, and destiny bends beneath the will of the few. One such moment unfolded on the windswept plains of Greece, where farmers, merchants, and craftsmen stood shoulder to shoulder against the mightiest empire the world had ever seen. What happened that day would echo through the centuries, whispered by poets, carved into legend, and remembered as the dawn of Western freedom. This is the story of Marathon, the day when democracy drew its sword against tyranny, and the gods seemed to hold their breath. The year was 490 BC. Across the plains near the village of Marathon, dark sails appeared on the horizon. The storm that arrived was not made of thunder or rain, but of soldiers, ships, and empire. The Persians had come, an unstoppable force from the east, their armies vast, disciplined, and armed with the most advanced weapons of their age. Their target was small and defiant. Athens, a young democracy that had dared to challenge the rule of the King of Kings. By every measure of reason, Athens should have been erased, its people enslaved, its name forgotten. And yet, what followed would defy the arithmetic of power. On that plain, a handful of citizen soldiers stood their ground, launched one of the most daring charges in recorded history, and changed the course of civilization forever. The Persian army that landed at Marathon was no ordinary host. It was the very hammer of the empire. Tens of thousands of men, veterans of countless campaigns, commanded by experienced generals and supplied by the wealth of a realm stretching from the Indus River to the edge of the Mediterranean. Their mission was simple: crush Athens, march 26 miles to its gates, and teach the Greeks a lesson in submission. Standing in their way were a few thousand Athenian hoplites, aided only by a few hundred allies from the small city of Plataea. They were outnumbered more than 2 to 1. By all logic, they should have been doomed. But logic would find no place on that battlefield. Instead, the Athenians dealt the Persians one of the most astonishing defeats in ancient warfare, a victory so profound that it reshaped the destiny of Greece, and with it, the very foundations of the Western world. But to understand why Marathon became possible, the story must turn back nearly a decade earlier to the restless Greek cities of Ionia along the coast of modern-day Turkey. For half a century, these cities had lived under Persian rule. Though Persia often ruled with tolerance, allowing local customs and limited autonomy, it still demanded heavy tribute and obedience through puppet tyrants. To the fiercely independent Greeks, this was intolerable. By 499 BC, resentment boiled over into open revolt. The man who lit the fuse was Aristagoras, the ambitious tyrant of Miletus. Knowing he could not challenge Persia alone, he sailed westward in search of allies. His first stop was Sparta, Greece's greatest military power. There, he spread out a map and promised the Spartans the riches of the East. But the Spartans were cautious, traditional, and deeply conservative. When they learned that the march to Persia's capital would take 3 months, they refused. Too far, too uncertain, too costly. Rejected in Sparta, Aristagoras turned to Athens, appealing not to greed, but to kinship, reminding them that Miletus was originally an Athenian colony. The message struck a chord. Athens, freshly liberated from its own tyrants, was now a young democracy brimming with revolutionary spirit. The idea of freeing fellow Greeks from Persian rule wasn't just strategic, it was moral. Athens agreed to help, sending 20 ships. The nearby city of Eretria sent 5 more. In 498 BC, this small coalition, Athenians, Eretrians, and Ionians, struck at the heart of Persian power in Asia Minor. They marched on Sardis, the regional capital, catching the governor Artaphernes off guard. The lower city was taken, and in the chaos, fire consumed much of Sardis, including its sacred temple. To the Greeks, it was a symbolic victory, a strike against the very face of empire. But victory was fleeting. As the rebels withdrew, Persian reinforcements crushed them. The Athenians retreated across the sea, leaving the Ionians to face Persia's wrath alone. By 494 BC, the revolt was annihilated. Miletus was razed to the ground, its population enslaved. Yet one man could not forget, King Darius of Persia. The Athenians had dared to burn one of his cities, a personal insult the great king could not forgive. Ancient historian Herodotus tells a chilling tale of Darius's fury. The king supposedly fired an arrow into the sky, praying for vengeance against Athens, and commanded a servant to whisper to him at every meal, "Master, remember the Athenians." From that moment, the war ceased to be about rebellion. It became personal. Darius would not rest until Athens was punished so severely that no other city would ever dream of defiance again. In the summer of 490 BC, the Persian fleet set sail, 600 ships, carrying an army led by the seasoned commanders Datis and Artaphernes, Darius's own nephew. Their first target was Eretria. The city fell after betrayal from within. Its people were enslaved, its temples burned. With Eretria destroyed, the Persians turned their gaze southward toward Athens. They landed at Marathon, a broad plain 26 miles from the city. The location was chosen deliberately. Its flat, open terrain was perfect for Persian cavalry, the empire's deadliest arm. Their plan was clear and efficient. Archers would shatter enemy formations with waves of arrows. Cavalry would strike to break their lines, and the infantry would sweep in to finish the slaughter. As the Persians disembarked, the scene must have been breathtaking. Tens of thousands of soldiers from across the empire, Egyptians, Medes, Babylonians, Scythians, all arrayed in glittering armor beneath the Aegean sun. They carried short spears, daggers, and large wicker shields, designed for mobility and speed. It was a force built to conquer, and against most foes, it would have been unstoppable. But within that design lay a hidden flaw, one that the Athenians were about to exploit with unmatched courage. When news of the landing reached Athens, panic spread through the city like wildfire. Everyone knew the odds. The Persians had brought one of the largest armies on earth. Athens had no standing professional force. What they had were citizens, farmers, potters, blacksmiths, merchants, men who, when the city called, left their livelihoods to fight. They were not soldiers by profession, but they were bound by something far stronger, the will to defend their freedom. And on that day, beneath the rising sun of Marathon, that would be tested against an empire. In ancient Greece, serving as a hoplite was more than a military duty. It was a declaration of one's place in society, a visible mark of citizenship, pride, and sacrifice. To take up that role, every man was required to furnish his own armor and weapons, an expense that only those with means could afford. This equipment, known collectively as a panoply, represented the height of craftsmanship and the weight of obligation. The typical hoplite was encased in bronze. A heavy breastplate protected his chest, gleaming greaves covered his shins, and over his face rested the fearsome Corinthian helmet, its narrow eye slits and rigid nose guard transforming the soldier into something both heroic and intimidating. Behind that cold mask, sweat and breath mingled, but from the outside, he looked untouchable, an image of order and resolve in a world often ruled by chaos. The hoplite's main weapon was the dory, a long spear roughly 9 feet in length, designed to be thrust rather than thrown. It was the tool of precision and unity, a weapon whose effectiveness depended not only on the strength of the man who wielded it, but on the coordination of the entire line. When the press of battle grew too close, when spear shafts shattered and the fight became a desperate melee, the hoplite reached for his short sword, a final measure when all else failed. Yet, the most vital piece of all was not the weapon, but the shield, the great aspis. The aspis was more than a piece of armor. It was a philosophy in bronze and wood, nearly 3 feet across and faced with polished metal. It was built to endure punishment and deliver security. Its clever grip distributed weight across both shoulder and forearm, allowing a man to carry it for hours under the Mediterranean sun. But the shield's true genius lay in its purpose. It did not merely defend the man who bore it, it protected the man beside him. In the phalanx, every soldier's aspis overlapped with his neighbor's, linking them into an unbreakable wall of wood and bronze. Each man's courage reinforced the next, and each weakness threatened the whole. Behind that gleaming wall, rows of spears jutted outward like the quills of some immense and living creature. The phalanx, 8 ranks deep, was more than formation. It was the physical embodiment of Greek unity and trust. It moved as one organism, a human machine designed for a single purpose: to advance relentlessly, driving forward until the enemy broke. When Athens prepared for the Battle of Marathon, it mustered roughly 9,000 of these citizen soldiers. But they were not entirely alone. From the small city of Plataea came 1,000 more, a gesture of solidarity so profound that it would never be forgotten. In this moment of crisis, Plataea gave everything it had, standing shoulder to shoulder with its larger ally. That act would be remembered as a defining moment of Greek brotherhood, echoing through generations of poets and historians. Still, even united, the numbers told a grim story. The Persian force arrayed against them was at least twice their size, perhaps more. Their empires stretched from the Indus Valley to the Aegean, and their armies were an extension of that vastness, disciplined, experienced, and innumerable. Worst of all, Athens' greatest ally, the military powerhouse of Sparta, had not yet arrived. In desperation, Athens sent a messenger, the famed runner Phidippides, to plead for aid. He ran 150 miles to Sparta in just 2 days, a feat that would echo through legend. The Spartans agreed to help, but not yet. They were in the midst of the sacred festival of the Carnea, during which the laws forbade any military campaign until the full moon rose. They promised to march as soon as the festival ended, but time was a luxury the Athenians did not have. At Marathon, they would stand alone. The Athenian army marched from their city and took up position on the low hills overlooking the broad, flat plain of Marathon. The choice of ground was deliberate. From those slopes, they blocked the road to Athens, forcing the Persians to face them directly rather than bypass their line. Below them, along the coast, stretched the massive Persian encampment, a sprawl of tents, banners, and ships gleaming beneath the sun. For several tense days, the two forces watched one another, neither willing to make the first move. The Persians, led by Datis and Artaphernes, believed that time favored them. The open plain suited their cavalry, and they assumed the Greeks would weaken as the days dragged on. Meanwhile, political tension brewed in Athens itself. Some citizens sympathized with the Persians, hoping to restore the exiled tyrant Hippias, who had returned with the invaders. For the Persians, delay was strategy. For the Athenians, it was peril. Inside the Greek camp, debate raged among the commanders. The Athenian army was led not by a single general, but by 10, each representing one of the city's tribes, with the war archon Callimachus holding the deciding vote when opinions split. And split they were. Half argued for waiting, holding the hills until Sparta arrived. The others, led by Miltiades, pushed for immediate action. Miltiades was no stranger to Persian power. He had once lived under their rule and even served in their armies. He knew their methods, the strength of their cavalry, the precision of their archers, but he also knew their weaknesses. He warned that every day of hesitation risked catastrophe. The Persians might incite rebellion in Athens, or worse, sail around to attack the undefended city directly. Waiting for Sparta, he argued, would be gambling with their freedom itself. Miltiades appealed passionately to Callimachus, laying the choice bare: fight now and preserve liberty, or delay and watch Athens fall into slavery. The words struck their mark. Callimachus cast his vote for war, breaking the deadlock and committing the Athenians to battle. Yet even then, Miltiades waited. The other generals ceded their days of command to him, effectively granting him full control of the army. He understood that one great obstacle remained: the Persian cavalry. The phalanx was mighty against infantry, but vulnerable to swift horsemen who could encircle and strike from the flanks. To attack while the cavalry stood ready would mean certain destruction. He watched the plain closely, biding his time. Then, one day, the moment arrived. Scouts raced back from the plains with stunning news. the Persian cavalry was gone. Whether they had been re-embarked on ships for a surprise strike at Athens, or had moved inland in search of supplies, no one could say. But they were gone, and with them, the Persians' greatest advantage vanished. Miltiades seized the moment without hesitation. The sun was rising over the hills of Marathon, the light glinting off thousands of bronze helmets. The long silence that had hung between the two armies was broken by the steady rhythm of advancing feet. The Athenian line began to move, first in silence, then with the growing thunder of thousands of shields and spears striking in unison. It was not merely an army marching to battle. It was a civilization defending its right to exist. Against the greatest empire the ancient world had ever known, the citizens of a small democracy advanced with faith in one another, bound by bronze, by courage, and by the fragile hope that freedom was worth any price. At that moment, on the plain of Marathon, history itself began to turn. Miltiades was not a man who followed the safe or the expected. He understood that the battle ahead would not be won through convention, but through daring. What he conceived on the plain of Marathon was something almost revolutionary for its time, a calculated gamble that would determine the fate of Athens itself. In every Greek phalanx, the army usually formed a uniform wall of shields, 8 men deep, standing shoulder to shoulder, a formation perfected over generations. It was a system built on strength, discipline, and equality across the line. But Miltiades knew the Persians better than anyone else among the Athenian generals. He had lived among them once and had seen their methods firsthand. The Persians always placed their most elite warriors, their trained native infantry, and the fierce Saka tribesmen in the center, forming a solid, deadly core. To face them head-on with equal depth would mean disaster. The smaller Athenian army would be swallowed whole, its flanks rolled up by the sheer number of Persian troops. So Miltiades made a choice that defied tradition. He stretched his line across the same width as the Persian host, thinning the center until it stood barely half the depth of a normal formation. Those men removed from the middle, he placed at the wings, creating a trap disguised as weakness. On the right stood Miltiades himself beside Callimachus, the Athenian polemarch whose vote for war had brought them to this day. On the left, the brave soldiers of Plataea, Athens' only allies, held their ground with grim determination. The center, fragile and exposed, was the bait. If the Persians lunged for it, Miltiades planned to let them drive in deep before the Greek wings folded inward like a closing jaw, crushing the invaders from both sides. It was, in essence, one of the earliest examples of the pincer movement, centuries before the term would ever exist. The order to advance rippled down the line. 10,000 armored hoplites began to move forward, each step shaking the earth beneath them. Every man carried the heavy weight of his panoply, a bronze shield nearly a meter across, a spear almost 9 feet long, a short sword for the chaos of close combat, a helmet that muffled sound and stifled air, and often a bronze cuirass gleaming in the morning light. More than 50 pounds of armor pressed on every shoulder. The sun climbed higher, and the heat of the plain rose like fire from the ground. Dust clung to their feet, sweat streamed down their faces, and yet they moved forward unbroken, in perfect rhythm. Ahead, the Persian army stretched across the horizon, tens of thousands of men from across an empire that spanned 3 continents. Archers, cavalry, infantry, and slaves stood ready to destroy the defiant Greek force that dared to resist the will of the great king. Then, with perfect timing, Miltiades gave the command that stunned the world. He ordered a full charge. The line of hoplites broke into a run, 10,000 armored men sprinting across the plain, their shields flashing in the sunlight. To the Persians, the sight was madness itself. Never before had heavy infantry charged over such distance, without cavalry or archers to support them. It must have looked like suicide, but Miltiades' calculation was precise. By running, his men would spend only moments under the deadly rain of Persian arrows. The archers loosed volley after volley, darkening the sky, but most shafts clattered harmlessly against bronze shields and helmets or were absorbed by thick linen armor. And as the Greeks closed the gap, their momentum transformed into unstoppable power. The impact when the phalanx collided with the Persian line was like a thunderclap, a wall of bronze smashing into wicker and flesh. On the wings, the result was immediate and brutal. The heavily armored Greeks tore through the lightly equipped Persian levies. Spears thrust and broke. Men screamed, and blood spattered across the dry earth. The Persian flanks, unprepared for such ferocity, began to crumble. Soldiers dropped their weapons and fled toward the safety of ships. But at the center, where the Persian elite met the thinned Athenian line, the struggle was desperate beyond imagination. Shield pressed against shield, men fought in a suffocating crush where survival came down to inches. Spears shattered, swords flashed, and bodies fell by the dozens. The Athenians fought with everything they had, but slowly, the Persians drove them back. The line sagged under pressure, bending dangerously. For a moment, it seemed as though Miltiades' gamble had failed, that the center would finally break, and with it, all hope of victory. And then, at the critical instant, Miltiades' plan revealed its brilliance. The victorious Greek wings, instead of pursuing the fleeing enemy, halted, turned inward, and drove straight into the exposed sides of the Persian corps. The trap closed. Surrounded on three sides, the Persian elite found themselves caught in a nightmare of bronze and blood. Panic swept through their ranks like wildfire. The order of battle dissolved into chaos. Men screamed, dropped their weapons, and fled in all directions. The once mighty Persian host became a sea of terror. The plain of Marathon turned red as thousands fell beneath Greek spears. Those who fled toward the marshes found themselves trapped in mud, unable to move, and were cut down without mercy. The pursuit drove the survivors all the way to the sea, where the Persians tried desperately to reach their ships. There, the fighting was savage and close. Greek warriors leapt onto the decks, hacking and stabbing to prevent the ships from escaping. In the chaos, the Athenian hero Cynaegirus grabbed hold of a retreating ship with his bare hand, clinging to it until the enemy severed his arm with an axe. The Persians managed to escape with most of their fleet, but the Greeks captured 7 ships and left the beach strewn with the bodies of the dead. When the battle finally ended, the magnitude of the victory became clear. Over 6,400 Persians lay dead upon the field. The Athenians had lost only 192 and the Plataeans 11. Among the fallen was Callimachus, who had given his life after voting to defend his city. The Athenians buried their dead on the battlefield itself, raising a great mound over their graves, a monument that still stands today, whispering across the centuries of what courage once achieved. But victory brought no rest. The Persian fleet, though bloodied, had not been destroyed. It sailed around Cape Saunian, aiming to reach Athens before the army could return, hoping to find the city defenseless. The Athenians, exhausted and battered, faced a final, impossible task. After running across the plain, fighting in suffocating heat, and pursuing their enemies to the sea, they now had to march the full 26 miles back to Athens in full armor, without pause. Yet they did not hesitate. Driven by love for their city and fear for their families, they forced their weary bodies onward. Step by step, through pain and exhaustion, they reached Athens just as the Persian fleet appeared on the horizon. When the Persians saw the same Greek army, still defiant and ready for battle, standing on the shore, they turned their ships away. The invasion had failed. Athens was safe. The Battle of Marathon was more than a triumph of arms. It was the birth of an idea. It proved that the great empire of Persia could bleed, that free citizens could stand against tyranny and prevail. This victory gave Greece a new confidence, one that would echo through the decades that followed. When Xerxes returned 10 years later with a greater army, the Greeks remembered Marathon and stood their ground again at Thermopylae, Salamis, and Plataea. For Athens, Marathon marked the beginning of its golden age, a time of art, philosophy, democracy, and greatness that would shape the course of Western civilization. The memory of that day endured, carried through centuries not only in monuments and stories, but in the very spirit of human defiance. The modern marathon run may recall the legendary messenger Pheidippides, who brought word of victory to Athens, but the true legacy of marathon lies deeper. It is the eternal lesson that courage, unity, and belief in freedom can allow even the few to triumph against the many, and that the destiny of history can be rewritten by those brave enough to stand when the world expects them to fall.